Hi friends, greetings everyone. In this video, I have to confess an error from the last video. Whenever I discuss a topic, I like to dig a little deeper into it, behind the scenes. And sometimes, doing this, I find something I overlooked. In the current edition of the chart book, which I have here, there is nothing about Samuel's birth date within a year, or about the relationship to the spring equinox. Only the year is estimated, not the day or month. Most parts of this chronology book, on the biblical side of things, are not estimated. But if something is, then I say so. What I am discussing here is already charted in a future edition of this book. Ongoing research is the nature of this subject. Rest assured, the current edition is already light years ahead of anything else available. Listen to these videos enough and you will realize that. It was at the point in the last video where I talked about 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 20. At the great circuit of the days, I had said Samuel was conceived at that time. It turns out that he was born at that time, not conceived. How can that be? Especially when I have explained that the law of consecutives attached to the verbs implies strict sequence. A sequential reading of the text results in what I said in the last video. But I have known that the sequential reading may not be correct if there is compelling evidence that the sequence was different. Every so often, this then-next sense results in a contradiction. And when it does, the normative rule should not be followed. There is, in fact, a rare but nevertheless well-attested usage of the wav, which sends the timeline backward. The wav remote. I will illustrate this with Genesis 2:19. The King James Version puts it, "And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field, and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them." Genesis 2, verse 19, is after the creation of Adam. But note that the animals were created before Adam. That's what the first chapter tells us. The second chapter seems to say the animals were made after Adam, and that is the contradiction. The Genesis 2:19 text implies they were created after Adam. If "and" at the start of verse 19 means "then next," then there is a contradiction with chapter 1. Various versions try to solve this problem in various ways. The New International Version and some other versions fix the problem this way. Now, the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals. Using "had formed" eliminates the contradiction. The past perfect "had formed" indicates that the animals were created before Adam, just as chapter 1 states. Can we do this in Hebrew? First, let's see how it applies to the case of Samuel's birth. So, what if we translate 1 Samuel 1:20 this way? "Then it is at the great circuit of the days, and Hannah had conceived, then she bears a son." This would now say that Samuel was born at the beginning day of the year. I call this past perfect use of the wav consecutive the wav remote. Without getting too technical here, I have to explain how the wav consecutive turns into a wav remote. The Hebrew is in the imperfect tense, and not the perfect tense. So the sense of "had" is arrived at differently. The easiest way to explain it is that the normal "then next" of the wav consecutive is taken to mean "back then." English mirrors this usage, as this story shows. "Then I woke up the kids. Then I fed them breakfast. Then my wife got up. Then I bought waffles, which the kids were happily eating when my wife arrived at the table." We expect, "and I had bought waffles." But the astute interpreter of my words will interpret "then I bought waffles" as "back then I bought waffles," rather than "then next I bought waffles," since I had to buy the waffles before my kids could be eating them. In other words, then means at that time. Back then, in the past, I was talking about. The WAV consecutive changes to a WAV remote by the same argument. Most scholars would make the context the only clue that the WAV consecutive is really a WAV remote. I, however, tend to believe that the change was indicated by a feature in Hebrew that was not transmitted in the consonantal text. These are the vowel points. What if an ancient Hebrew speaker indicated the remoteness of his usage of the WAV by compounding it with a WAV conjunctive? So instead of "Wa-tahar," then she conceives, "U-wa-tahar" was said, and then she conceives. The compounded WAV conjunctive effectively resets the timeline. The "and then" converts the sense of "then" to "back then, at that time," the equivalent of the English pluperfect, "had." So how does "uwa" show up in a consonant text? It doesn't, as the "u" would be a dagesh in the WAV. The WAV conjunctive would contract into the WAV consecutive, making it a WAV remote, equivalent to the English "and had." I could also argue that the stress shifts forward when this happens. "U-wa-tahar" versus "wa-tahar." The main reason I suspect something like this occurred is that too much burden is being placed on the context to tell the difference between the WAV consecutive and the WAV remote, if no semantic distinction occurs. Regardless of my suggestion, scholars now agree that context is the only means left to us presently to tell the difference. The present vowels in the text are an interpretation and are not actually received from the original copy. And we have seen before that the scribes after the 6th century AD did not always rightly guess the proper points. So, what did I notice in the context of Hannah's giving birth to Samuel? First, I noticed that some commentators were arguing that the circuit of the days could be applied to the birth and not the conception. When I saw this, WAV remote occurred to me as the only way to justify this opinion. At this moment, everything jumped into place in a flash. The narrative implies that the answer to Hannah's prayer was not delayed, but without the WAV remote, the answer is very delayed. Here is the delayed sequence. Number 1. Hannah makes her request at a feast. If we suppose Sukkot, this will produce the shortest timeline. Number 2. She conceived 6 months later, at the spring equinox. Number 3. She gives birth in the next December, about 266 days later. Number 4. She says the child is not weaned and stays home from Passover. But this is not what the narrative implies. Their immediate departure from the feast is noted in 1 Samuel 1:19. Then they rise up in the morning and worship at the face of Yahweh. Then they return. Then they come to their house, to Ramah. Then Elkanah knows Hannah, his wife. Then Yahweh remembered her. So here is the timeline with the WAV remote. Number 1. Hannah makes her request at a feast. I suppose it was Shavuot, otherwise known as Pentecost, a one-day feast, which explains their immediate leaving on the next day better. Number 2. She conceives as soon as her monthly cycle hits the right point after they get home. Number 3. Samuel is born the next spring equinox. Number 4. Right after this, the family goes to Passover, but Hannah stays home with Samuel. The sense is like this. Then it is at the great circuit of the days, and Hannah had conceived. Then she bears a son. Using this data, I fixed an ideal year for Samuel's birth in 1163 BC, since this year has a minimum of days between Shavuot in 1164 BC and the new year. This is 288 days. I will call it an ideal year because, of course, if the gestation period were not the ideal average, or the conception and birth did not happen on the new moon days, then possibly some other year nearby would be the case. Samuel's lifespan comes out to 97 years using this model, and a future edition will include this. As for the estimate in the current edition, the difference is only 3 years. It will be labeled the ideal year, since, of course, I had to use some ideal assumptions to make the adjustment. I apologize for the complication, and it is the cost of correcting the mistake. Thank you for listening. Be sure to support this channel by buying my books. I have ebook versions of all of my books also. You can find them all at worldwideweb.torahtimes.org.